Right, afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. For those who don't know me, I'm Tom Hyatt. I'm joined by my colleague Alice Hepworth. We're both employment lawyers at Harrington Carmichael. So by way of a bit of introduction, we're employment lawyers, so we spend most of our time advising employers on day-to-day HR issues, essentially through the full employment life cycle, from employment contracts, policy drafting, all the way through to when things become contentious and disputes, dealing with employment tribunal claims. Over the past probably year, 12 months, 18 months or so, we've noticed a real clear shift in the way that workplace concerns are being raised and the way that disputes are developing and coming to fruition. I suspect that everyone on this webinar will probably agree that one of the reasons for that shift is linked to the increasing use of AI tools, ChatGPT, the likes of those by employees. So we thought it'd be a really useful session. We wanted to put this session together because this isn't just a theoretical issue we're seeing, but something that we're actually dealing with now, that we know that a lot of HR teams and managers are dealing with as well. We're seeing the use of ChatGPT and other AI tools in grievances, disciplinaries, through consultation processes, and even into tribunal litigation across a wide range of sectors. This doesn't, it's not an issue that affects just one sector. It's across the full range. All employers, we get the sense, are now seeing this. Can I hand over to my colleague Alice to tackle first part of this? We really want to look at what we're seeing. Suspect it might be similar to what you're dealing with, and then we'll move on to some of our tips and how we suggest you go about tackling this. So Alice, over to you.
Cool, thanks, Tom. So yeah, just to be clear, I guess at the outset, AI hasn't created any new employment rights. It hasn't rewritten the Equality Act. It hasn't secretly amended unfair dismissal overnight. We're all aware of that on the horizon, and that's no secret. But like Tom said, what it has done is change the way that disputes are expressed, escalated, and has shifted what we're now dealing with. And that shift is significant, and one that we suspect you are all dealing with. Yes, this webinar will be recorded and we'll circulate it afterwards. So what I wanted to start with is what we're actually seeing on the ground in terms of, grievances, disciplinaries, general ER issues, because we have certainly seen, a monumental increase over the past year, but particularly over the last few months. And that's actually, only one, I guess, visible symptom of something much bigger. What we're really seeing, I guess, is a structural shift in how workplace disputes are being put together. And what I mean by that is, how they're expressed, how quickly they're formulated, and then I guess a shift in how, we on the receiving end of it are perceiving that correspondence when it becomes immediately obvious that an employee has been using ChatGPT within the first 3 sentences of reviewing it. And then ultimately, I guess the impact of that in turn is that we're seeing a huge change in employment tribunal litigation. But that is a whole separate beast to tackle, and one that we'll come to later. AI isn't just changing documents, it's changing behaviour, it's changing confidence, it's changing the speed at which the ordinary workplace unhappiness becomes a formal conflict. What we're seeing is longer, more legally worded complaints. We're seeing complaints that read like War and Peace, ones that cite the Equality Act, they refer to whistleblowing, they talk about breach of trust and confidence, they refer to procedural fairness and phrases like natural justice that we're all becoming so familiar with. But actually, when you strip it back, quite often the substance hasn't changed. The underlying issues haven't changed. What has changed is the packaging in terms of how workplace disputes are formed, expressed, escalated. In the past, there was, I guess, a natural gap between someone feeling unhappy at work and then changing it into a formal, legal allegation. Someone might talk to a colleague, they might sit with it for a few days, they might draft something, redraft it. Turning frustration into a structured document took time and effort, and that time often allowed matters to cool down or to be resolved informally. And that pause now is much, much shorter. You know, if someone feels annoyed in the evening, they can generate a detailed 10-page grievance within minutes. And so that movement from I'm unhappy to this is unlawful is happening much quicker. And obviously, when escalation becomes easier, it then becomes more common. And I think what's more apparent is seeing legal language appear much earlier in the life cycle of these disputes. You know, it's no longer confined to tribunal litigation or, you know, solicitor correspondence. Legal references, you know, whether correctly or incorrectly used, are now appearing in internal emails, flexible working requests, redundancy consultations. Instead of, I don't think this is fair, we are seeing, you know, this is indirect discrimination, or this constitutes victimization. And, you know, of course, sometimes that framing is justified, but sometimes it clearly isn't. But once that language enters the conversation, the tone then shifts. You know, managers are feeling exposed earlier. We're feeling pressure to formalize. And as a result, those processes are becoming heavier earlier. You know, the law hasn't changed, the temperature has. And I guess alongside that shift in escalation, we're seeing a clear increase in, you know, volume and the density of documentation. You know, grievances are longer, appeal submissions are more substantial, data subject access requests, which, you know, used to be relatively rare, are now a monthly occurrence. And what AI is very good at is expanding material, you know, suggesting legal angles, inserting references, inserting sections of the Equality Act into it. It will cite case law, often, you know, without context, sometimes inaccurately, and, you know, frequently actually without any connection to the real facts. And what I'm sure you're all seeing at the moment is, you know, pages and pages of legislation, case names layered on top of what actually might be a narrow, like in reality, a narrow workplace issue. And the frustration is that, I guess, a lot of the time you can probably solve these issues just by having a conversation. And I think it can be really overwhelming at first glance. You know, when you get your first ChatGPT written grievance, I think there is a real temptation to think, you know, we need to deal with all of this. But actually, when you strip it back, a lot of it is generic. It is template language. It is broad theories, rather than factual allegations. And I think you and I and all of us will appreciate that this has now created a different type of complexity. Tom, I think you wanted to look at how these sort of language models work.
Yeah, thanks. Something I did want to touch on. You've obviously mentioned that I completely agree with that AI is increasing the sheer volume of material that we are and HR professionals are having to deal with, have to tackle, having to respond to. But I also wanted to touch on exactly why it's not just the length or the volume, but it's the content that AI is producing. It's particularly challenging to respond to. And if we think back to how large language models actually work, without getting too technical, but fundamentally they are very clever predictive text agents. What they are looking at is they're predicting what's the most likely thing that would sound right in this context. So they're very good at producing authoritative language, but without necessarily considering the relevance to the issues here or proportionality. By nature of how it works, it tends to recycle language that it's been trained on. So you'll see AI produce content recycling standard dispute-related language. Often it will mirror common grievance, dispute language. It might be legally styled, but still fairly generic. And as a result, you'll be seeing fairly familiar templates rather than any tailored arguments. And we've got a slide, which is my favorite, just by way of an example. You may have seen these. I do not accept your position and consider your response to be inadequate and procedurally unfair. Your explanation fails to address the substantive issues raised and does not discharge your obligations. The response appears to be an attempt to justify a predetermined outcome rather than engage with the concerns. Now, that's great, and it sounds quite intimidating, and it does sound quite scary, and you think, well, I need to respond to this. I need to set out why we do address the substantive issues, or we do need to say why it's adequate and procedurally fair. But the reality is, sentences like this aren't really saying a great deal. There's no new allegations being raised in any of that content. It looks as if it is doing an awful lot more than what it is, and in reality, it's distracting from what the key issues are. It sounds like it's creating new argument when it's just disputing. It is just saying, no, I disagree with you there. And that's, again, typical of what AI often does. It expands rather than filters. Tools like ChatGPT, Copilot often will add issues in instead of narrowing them down to what is actually relevant here. What you might find is that a grievance suddenly contains complaints that the employee doesn't actually have, but they might have been encouraged by ChatGPT, another AI tool, to add it in because it thinks it's something that it will give some leverage. One of the key issues we find is that AI doesn't have a sense of closure in the way that a human would. There's no built-in concept of, fine, this issue has been dealt with, it's been responded to, even if we agree to disagree, or I should probably concede on this, there is no concept of closure. If it's prompted again to respond, it will generate another response, and it can do that indefinitely. So that's why there's this inclination for it to continue disputes long before, long after they should have been drawn out. And going back to some of the examples on there, it can make repetition look like it's a new argument by just saying I disagree in a very nice and well-written way. It can make it sound like it's creating multiple new arguments, new concerns, when reality is that the substance just hasn't changed. And lastly, and this is probably the biggest challenge, Alice, you may agree or not, tools like ChatGPT typically reinforce the user's own position. It's designed to be helpful. It wants to be helpful. So it usually strengthens the prompter's own viewpoint rather than challenging it. So it acts as an amplifier. It's not an independent assessment of the situation. It amplifies and tells you what it thinks you might want to hear. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges because employees are suddenly being told that actually this relatively minor issue that could be resolved informally, it might be a grievance, but it's something that can be addressed. They're being told, actually, you have every right to be annoyed by this. I don't know, the thermostat being increased by half a degree is actually an issue. You should raise a grievance. You should sue your employer over this. When in reality, it's not proportionate. And if they were to talk to a lawyer or a friend even, they'd probably be told, okay, it's not a huge issue, but here's how you might resolve that. Instead, it's being escalated quicker because the AI tool is just agreeing and perpetuating someone's perception of annoyance over an issue. Anyway, back to you, Alice. I just thought it'd be important to touch on why specifically AI tools are challenging.
No, I agree. It makes yeah, it is an interesting change in terms of, what we are dealing with. So I guess the question that we're getting asked a lot sort of day in, day out is how on earth do we deal with this then? How do we respond without getting bogged down? So I thought it would be helpful just to go through sort of our, I guess, top tips in terms of how to deal with this. So the first one is remember the basics. They still apply. Anchor yourself in the process, whatever process that is. Whatever's being thrown at you doesn't change the procedural framework that you're operating within or that you've always operated within. We can't forget that, although it might be very easy to at times when you've got lovely worded sentences that make you sort of distract from what's being put forward. If it's a disciplinary issue, it's still a disciplinary process. If it's a grievance, it's still a grievance process. You have that structure, you have that policy in place. We know how they work. We've just got to remember that. And I think even if it's in 13 pages rather than one page or a paragraph like it might have been previously, don't feel intimidated by that. You have that structure. So having that investigation, meeting, outcome, appeal, consultation, whatever applies, just remember to, use it and anchor yourself in it. And I think sometimes there is a either, I guess, conscious or subconscious maybe shift in when a document cites legislation. the process suddenly goes from feeling like an internal couple of emails to feeling like litigation, but it isn't. It's still an internal ER process, which is going to be governed by your policies and, you know, the ACAS code where relevant, but that structure really is your anchor in all of this. So we need to remember to stick to it and to operate within it. I think the second point, and I guess, you know, probably one that Tom's mentioned as well, is, you know, narrow those issues down. AI generated material tends to expand. It amplifies things, it suggests additional angles, it layers in claims, it widens the scope. You know, your role is to narrow it back down to what actually requires the decision. So, you know, if there's an employee facing performance management, you know, and they're responding to you with a 5-page complaint citing various forms of discrimination, you'll still need to identify, you know, what is the decision that we're making, what processes are we following, what do we actually need to determine. And in that, a really effective technique, and I think one that works really well with these sorts of ER processes, is having a form of pre-meeting clarification. And what I mean by that is it's entirely legitimate to say to the employee, before we proceed, I just want to ensure that I understand what you're putting forward here. I want to understand your position correctly. The issues that I understand you to be raising are X, Y, Z. And in doing that, you can take a relatively, you know, lengthy document and distill it right down into 3 or 4 defined issues and summarize them really clearly. I think that is going to be appropriate. It's not inappropriate to do that, and it might just be necessary in these sort of elongated sort of correspondences that you're having even before a meeting takes place, just to say, just to confirm, this is what we understand your complaints to be, and then you're agreeing that scope or just confirming that scope and then proceeding on that basis. It's, you know, it's really important to remember that you're not obliged to investigate every single theoretical legal claim that's been inserted into a document. You're obliged to act reasonably in relation to the decisions that you're making, but actually that distinction matters enormously. The requirement to act reasonably hasn't changed. So just remembering, you know, what is reasonable in the circumstances, what is reasonable, what is a reasonable approach here, keeping that at the heart of your thinking and decision making is something that we all need to remember in sort of this changing dynamic. And I guess in turn with that, a trap that we often fall into with sort of these AI generated materials is escalation by response. So adding fuel to the fire by, you know, wanting to match their tone. You don't always need to respond point by point. And, you know, when faced with long legally referenced correspondence, I think there is a temptation to respond, you know, with a comprehensive rebuttal, addressing every point, every authority, every statutory reference. But internal ER processes aren't tribunal proceedings. So whether, you know, you're issuing a disciplinary outcome, a performance review decision, redundancy, selection, explanation, grievance outcome, whatever you're doing, the questions are going to be remaining the same as they always have done. So, you know, have we investigated appropriately? Have we considered all relevant evidence? Have we explained our reasoning clearly? You know, you don't need to give as good as you've got. Once your internal process has run its course, it's run its course, because employees will often, once a process is concluded, will say, you know, you haven't dealt with XYZ. And sometimes XYZ are, you know, simply restatements of points that you've already addressed. You know, it is entirely legitimate to say, we have actually previously come back to you on this. You know, we've given you your answer, refer them back to that answer. You can do that. You don't need to rehash it. You don't need to be changing the font, restructuring, rewording things just to make the same point over and over again. You know, be confident enough to say, thank you, but, you know, we have actually already responded to these points, and we have concluded that process. Just because an employee tells you to doesn't mean you're required to engage in, you know, rolling correspondence simply because they refer to some legal terminology. You know, act within your legal obligations, of course, but once that process has concluded, you you can say that and you can make that point and have the confidence to make that point.
Yeah, just to jump in there, Alice. I think that's right, and I think if we think back to the slide, we had a couple of examples of the type of language that we see, and I'm sure that you're seeing the type of I don't accept your position, I consider your response inadequate. That is often the time, I think, to take a moment to pause, just ask the very simple question of, is there actually anything new here? Do we need to respond to this? Just ask yourself the question, are there new facts being raised, new allegations? Is there any new information that we need to investigate? Or is this simply somebody expressing their disagreement in stronger language to our decision? And if it's the latter, like Alice said, it might be entirely appropriate just to send a simple email to say, we're noting your view and we confirm that our position has already been set out. You might say something along the lines of, thanks very much for your email. We note your views. Our position has already been set out in previous correspondence, whether that's the grievance appeal outcome, a disciplinary appeal outcome, and there are no further steps within that process. So it's important just to take a moment to think, actually, do we need to respond to this, or is it better to try and draw a line under this? Anyway, interrupted you. Sorry, Alice, back to you.
It's not good. No, I think it's important things to remember, because I think often they become forgotten when there's so much correspondence being fired at you. I think in terms of that, and in terms of sort of the protracted sense that there's no sort of closure on any of these processes, one of the most effective ways to deal with AI inflated correspondence is actually really simple, is to get people in a room. When grievances or responses are, AI assisted, is so often it is unclear which parts actually, genuinely reflect their actual concerns and which parts are just, expanded legal additions. So a face-to-face meeting allows you to cut through that. You can ask in simple terms, what is the main issue? You can and just address that and have that conversation. You can follow a script, as you might sometimes do in those processes, in those meetings, where you're looking at the actual issues, particularly if you've already done some form of pre-meeting clarification, just to have then a really sort of direct approach to the meeting. Quite often the real concern is far narrower than what their complaint actually suggests, and more often than not, an employee won't actually realise the substance of what they have generated out of ChatGPT. So that's where that, removing that AI element from it can really help. We are all humans, and if we can remove that from it, we can resolve those issues much quicker. So actually having that conversation can help distill those issues. So rather than responding to pages of legislation, pages of case law, you can hone in on the actual issues. You can summarize what you understand their complaints to be, and then that slightly also, I guess, mitigates the risk that you're then going to end up in endless written exchanges. So just keep it focused on the substance and what they are feeling, without the noise of the AI. And of course, comes with a health warning. Obviously, you can't rigidly insist on in-person attendance. If there are disabilities or other considerations, reasonable adjustments still stand, that those procedures are still the same. They might be needed, but wherever it is appropriate, prioritize actual human engagement over lengthy AI correspondence is usually the most effective way to either regain control if you feel like you've lost it and regain some clarity in that situation, but also on the flip side, then getting that control from the outset and just maintaining that control from the outset. I think the last thing to mention is, it's as much about mindset as it is about law. Just keep confident. You're good at this. You've got, your experience in your job. We, you, us, HR professionals shouldn't be intimidated by length or legal references. The presence of legislation in a document doesn't automatically increase liability. And I think we often can get taken aback by that, but the number of pages doesn't correlate to merit. You are still dealing with a workplace issue. You are still applying your policy. You are still addressing facts. You know, these are your processes. These are your procedures. Don't allow yourself to be bullied, pressured, destabilized by legal terminology inserted into internal correspondence. So you've got to remember that, you know, have confidence, stay structured, stay proportionate, and stay focused on the decision that you actually need to make. I think the law hasn't changed, you know, yet, but what has changed is how we need to be dealing with ER issues. But, you know, if you respond to the substance rather than the noise across, you know, these grievances, grumblings, consultations, complaints, etc., then that's how you regain or retain control throughout all of this.
Alice, I was just having a read through some of the questions we've been asked, and I should have said at the start, I always forget. We will absolutely have a time, hopefully a good 10, 15 minutes at the end to tackle any questions. So please feel free to drop them in the chat box. But there was one that I just wanted to answer now because it seemed to fit very well with one of the points that you made about face-to-face meetings, keeping your confidence. And it was about de-escalation and when we should be trying to implement de-escalation practices. And I think absolutely. If it's a minor issue that we're really thinking there's no reason why this should be dealt with in such a long formal process, yes, try and de-escalate. But the point that you made, Alice, about face-to-face meetings or a phone call, trying to add a more human element to it would be one of my top tips for de-escalation. If you're dealing with an employee who is sending relentlessly long pieces of correspondence, emails, appeals, further submissions, just getting them in a room, getting them on the phone where they're not going to stew on it or pump it into ChatGPT. That might be your best way of trying to de-escalate it before it carries on into a more formal process. But anyway, like I said, any more questions, please drop them in the box. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can in the time we have at the end. Moving on, because we said we would come back to this. Now, appreciate that this is obviously something that we are probably seeing more than HR teams, but I think it's still important to share some of the knowledge that we've gained over the last year or so in dealing with employment tribunal claims, where we've got claimants using AI to assist them. We've obviously been talking previously, and Alice has been talking about internal processes, grievances, disciplinaries, consultation exercises. Obviously, matters don't always resolve there. And this is where the landscape is also changing quite significantly when a dispute moves into the employment tribunal. Fundamentally, AI is making access to the tribunal system more accessible. It's now far simpler, far easier for an employee to draft a claim without any legal assistance. Before, historically, that's always been the case, and employees have always been able to submit claims without lawyers. The difference is what we've seen in the past, typically, where claimants are self-represented, they don't have legal assistance, is relatively short, not particularly detailed or claim forms. And after the claims have been submitted, it's been a fairly passive involvement from them towards a final hearing, and it's been, wouldn't say easier to deal with, but simpler, less correspondence, less time incurred. So now with AI assisting claimants, we're seeing far more claims, not necessarily because workplaces have deteriorated or because there's more issues and people are being treated worse, but because that barrier to entry is lowered. What that doesn't mean, though, is that the merits of claims have improved. And in fact, dare I say it, we're probably seeing more and more claims being brought in the employment tribunal that are actually quite weak, because, again, the cost is nearly nil for them bringing claims. And like I said, claim forms are longer, much longer than they used to be, frequently including multiple legal claims listed together, discrimination, whistleblowing, breach of contract, unfair dismissal, sometimes without the clear factual basis to support that, because the likes of your ChatGPT are putting together legal arguments without actually being armed with the factual narrative to support that. Case law statutory references are often now included in claim forms. It doesn't mean that they're already correct. And one of the big problems we see is the concept of hallucinations in large language models and its AI tools like ChatGPT coming up with content because it sounds plausible and it wants to give you an answer, but actually it just doesn't exist. And we've seen it time and time again with claim references being completely made up, citations that we cannot find, they don't exist, and it very quickly becomes obvious that, well, this has been AI generated. Naturally, it's quite difficult to respond to a case citation that doesn't exist. Key things to remember, though: a longer claim doesn't necessarily make it a more complex dispute. And in fact, I think our jobs in responding to a claim that's been drafted with AI, that's probably not hugely more difficult. And in fact, a claim that's setting out the specific claims that we know what they are trying to bring, even if the facts don't support that or there isn't any factual basis, can actually help us narrow the issues earlier on, because we know we're responding to a whistleblowing claim or an unfair dismissal claim without having to ask the claimant to confirm that. The bigger challenge, the bigger challenge that we're seeing is often what happens after we've responded to a claim that's come in through the employment tribunal. What we're seeing is AI-assisted claimants engaging in long, extensive, ongoing correspondence with the tribunal after we've submitted a defence. What we are seeing typically is emails disputing the defence, attempts to introduce new allegation outside of the initial pleadings. So a claimant might submit a claim, we would submit a response. The standard practice is then perhaps for a preliminary hearing to be listed, a final hearing to be listed, which would ultimately go on to determine the issues. There would obviously be all the preparatory stages in between of witness statements, disclosing of evidence, but it's very procedurally driven. What we are now seeing is claim form being submitted, us responding to it, and then claimants jumping on that opportunity to think that they need to argue their case or dispute our defence. And that's because I think AI doesn't fully grasp the tribunal procedure. We're seeing this with applications as well. What would normally happen if we had to make an application to the employment tribunal, or if a claimant is making an application to the tribunal, is one party makes a formal application, the other party has the opportunity to respond to that application, and then it's for the tribunal to determine. They might want a hearing to consider the application, or quite often they might consider that based on both parties' submissions. What the tribunal doesn't expect is a rolling debate by email. They don't expect an objection to an application to then have another response and another response. But obviously, if you were to copy and paste everything that's being said into ChatGPT, I'm sure it would be very helpful. It would produce another submission, and it might make the argument again for the 10th time that the changing of the thermostat was actually a detriment, and that we completely disagree with the respondent's position and the defence here. But that doesn't align with what the tribunal expect, and it's not helpful for focusing on the actual issues. It creates satellite litigation. By that I mean minor procedural disputes that don't actually focus on the claim that's being brought. So in other words, cases are being dominated by these side issues rather than the core claim, the core issues that the tribunal need to determine, which might be, was somebody subjected to discrimination, or was somebody unfairly dismissed? What we're seeing then is those procedural disputes overshadowing the issues, and AI certainly fuels this. For example, unlike a human, a litigant in person, a claimant, there is no fatigue, there is no litigation fatigue. It brings us back to the point we made very early on, that there's no instinct for AI to know when to stop. It's very unlikely to advise somebody to do nothing. It'll carry on generating arguments for those minor points. And that's rarely in anyone's interests. Rarely is it in their interests, or is it in the respondent's interest to carry on engaging in that satellite litigation. We've had a case fairly recently where, through no fault of anyone's, the respondent received the claim form late. It was a tribunal administrative error, but as a result, it was received late. So naturally, we still had to make an application to explain why it was received late, to explain that it wasn't our fault, and to request a longer amount of time to submit a response. We've seen cases where that's then been dropped into ChatGPT, and there's ongoing disputes about the tribunal's decision to grant quite reasonably the decision to accept a later response. Now, that's something that anybody thinking rationally, thinking reasonably, any judge in the country is going to say, no, that's fine, that's a fair decision. But because people can, we're seeing those type of decisions disputed. An important reality check here, though, and something to remember, is that the tribunal won't engage in every single piece of correspondence. Its main focus is on preparing for a final hearing, case management, and these excessive emails often are not read in detail. They're not put before a judge. Simply, they are noted on the file and left to be determined at a final hearing. So what I think you and importantly your lawyers as well should be focusing on is determining when intervention is actually necessary. And this kind of mirrors the way that Alice recommended tips for dealing with internal disputes and disciplinaries and grievances, which is focusing on, do we need to respond to this? And because the tribunal aren't going to engage or want to deal with every single bit of correspondence, it's important for us not to increase the time spent unnecessarily, disproportionately. It's important not to incur costs unnecessarily. So, like I said, selective engagement is essential, responding only where necessary. It's obviously our job to identify when it's necessary, when something can be ignored and just left for the tribunal to determine. Often we will decide to intervene and respond where there might be material, factual inaccuracies being put forward by a claimant, misleading statements to the tribunal that we are obliged to correct, where there might be any potential procedural unfairness or prejudice for you as employers. And ultimately any issues that could actually affect the directions for a claim or the outcome. That's when it becomes important for us to get involved. Otherwise, restraint can be a stronger strategy so as to not burden the tribunal's time and not to incur time and costs unnecessarily. A final point I wanted to touch on, and I've seen a question pop up in relation to this, so the answer is very much yes. It's on the point of costs in employment tribunals. Obviously, I've spent the last couple of minutes talking about some of the challenges that arise where a claimant is using AI throughout the proceedings and how we might tackle that. So I think it's also worth mentioning one of the more proactive tools that we have and that we're using increasingly to deal with and trying to prevent some of that lengthy, unnecessary correspondence in the first place, so that we can reduce what we're having to respond to. And like I said, it relates to costs. Now, costs orders, and by that I mean an order for one party to make a contribution or to pay the other's legal costs on the conclusion of their claim, are still relatively uncommon. It's quite rare. It's not unheard of, and I think we're seeing a shift where slowly more costs are awarded, but it is still rare. It's still uncommon. Typically, each party would bear their own costs in an employment tribunal hearing, but they can be awarded in certain circumstances. Now, historically, cost warnings or cost applications were most commonly made where a claim hasn't got any reasonable prospects of success. So in other words, where we say that this claim is not going to be successful, there's no realistic chance of this claim winning, we might make a cost application, or we might warn the claimant that if you continue with this claim that's not likely, then we might make an application for costs. And the reason is to try and put some pressure, but also give us the opportunity to apply for costs at a later stage if we need to. However, costs can also be awarded because of the way that a party conducts themselves through proceedings. So based on a claimant's conduct. This is something probably less commonly used until now. So if conduct is unreasonable or vexatious, or there's an abuse of the process, that can also justify a costs order being made, regardless as to the underlying merits of the claim. So even if the claim is actually quite strong, If somebody is being unreasonable, they're being vexatious in the way that they're conducting themselves through the proceedings, that can also be an avenue to make a costs application. This is why it's relevant. What we are increasingly seeing is conduct that is exactly that. It's disproportionate, it's borderline unreasonable, potentially vexatious. And like I mentioned, some of the things we're seeing in the tribunal process, minor procedural points becoming major battlegrounds, becoming satellite litigation, repeated arguments being advanced long after they've been dealt with by the tribunal, ongoing correspondence that adds lots of volume but doesn't add any substance. All of those things, that kind of approach drives up costs unnecessarily, and it allows us, though, quite reasonably to say, well, this is not reasonable conduct. Nobody receiving legal advice or nobody acting in a reasonable manner would be engaging in litigation in the way that we are seeing when encouraged by ChatGPT and AI. And like I said earlier, AI doesn't get fatigued. It doesn't. It's not very good at assessing proportionality. It doesn't know when to stop, and it doesn't know when to move on and just let an issue be decided by the employment tribunal. And it's that type of conduct that can be potentially unreasonable, can be vexatious. So what we are seeing and what we are using more and more in practice is the use of cost warnings, not only on the basis of claims that might not be very strong, but also unreasonable conduct. Essentially, we are warning claimants here that, look, you've got every right to bring your claim, but if you carry on conducting yourself and carry on causing additional unnecessary costs by not considering proportionality, we may make an application at the end of this for our clients' legal costs. So that's just one of the methods that we're using in practice just to try and combat and try and reduce. And often we see that being quite a useful tactic. Alice, I don't know your view on this, but we've seen it a few times where something like that, strategic cost warning, can actually make people change the way that they engage in litigation, can make them think, actually, maybe it's not sensible to be hounding the employment tribunal with repeated litigation. Maybe we should check case citations to make sure that we're not submitting case citations that are completely fictitious and therefore wasting everybody's time and costs.
Yes. I think alongside that, I think there's also, we're seeing at an earlier stage getting doing sort of requests for additional information alongside cost warnings. So where you are defending a claim that is, you know, fairly without basis, but they're just alleging various, I don't know, like in a whistleblowing claim, they're alleging various detriments that have come out of nowhere. I think taking it back to actually what the legal matters are that you are required to defend, as we always have been, and then in the putting that to the claimant, and then in the alternative, if they can't then provide that information, then sort of having cost applications alongside that. I think the other thing that, I guess, the tactic that we're seeing sort of using more often is applying for preliminary hearings at an earlier stage. So rather to address sort of substantive points within a case, rather than letting it run to a final hearing, obviously where appropriate, we are sort of speaking to our clients about potentially getting an assessment as to, you know, for instance, whether someone has blown the whistle at a very early, relatively early stage, rather than letting it go all the way on the basis that actually it's a ChatGPT formulated claim that has no basis. I think that's the other thing that I'd say.
Yeah, completely agree. But I'm a little bit conscious of time. I want to be able to answer any questions. I know we started a little bit late, so maybe we'll hang on if anyone has any burning questions they want answered. But just a couple of closing thoughts, and Alice, feel free to pitch in, because a lot of this is things that you did mention earlier. But to draw things together, what do we think? Look, clearly AI is changing the way that workplace disputes, concerns are expressed, escalated and litigated over. What hasn't changed, though, is the fundamentals, clear processes, careful fact-finding, proportionate responses, and ultimately sound judgment are still the most effective human tools that we have here. The key challenge now is not necessarily legal challenges. It's new volume, new tone, and new behavior. But in many situations here, you guys, HR professionals, employers, can manage this by following existing policies, staying calm, being structured, focusing on the substance rather than all of the noise and additional information that's generated by AI. There's obviously a time when taking legal advice becomes particularly valuable. For example, where legal terminology starts to really dominate correspondence, when new allegations do keep emerging. I suppose where there is some uncertainty as to a process or the risk factor of a certain situation, that's when it can be valuable to seek some advice early on. I think then really the final thing to remember, clearly it's making disputes longer, it's making disputes more challenging to deal with, but it doesn't make these disputes or certainly claims any stronger. We all know we've suddenly not become worse at our jobs. We are not treating employers worse than we were. Treating employees worse than we were 6 months ago. It is simply that the cost and time and barriers for raising disputes, raising grievances, disputing disciplinary outcomes is lower, which is why I think we're seeing much more of that. Ultimately, though, resolving disputes still depends on human judgment, and that's obviously completely necessary. I hope that's been helpful. That brings the session we've got planned to an end. Got a few minutes for any questions though, so please do fire them away. Alice, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the chat box yet and seen any questions.
Yeah, there's a few. Thank you. So I think there's just looked at Laura's question. So where it's sort of an ChatGPT exaggerated claim, are we finding that employers are being forced to have without prejudice conversations to close off the claim, regardless of it being a weak case, simply because it's in the business interest from a cost point of view? I think the important thing, I guess, with ACAS, yes, there's this whole sort of there's been a build up because the early conciliation period is now longer, coupled with the sort of an increased access to, I guess, a recommendation to start early conciliation at like a very early stage. So obviously I'm aware that that's something that we're all experiencing. I think you can just, let it run. You don't have to put offers forward in just, obviously there's sometimes a cost benefit to that, but actually if it's simply without basis, then putting an employee and just saying to them, getting them sort of, if they're willing to engage in a conversation with you, saying that what are you trying to achieve here? Because I think I've certainly had experiences where an employee has started early conciliation because that's what AI told it to do, and it didn't realize really what that meant, what the impact was in terms of a potential claim going forward. And then we had to sort of reel it back because it was not actually what they wanted to achieve. So I think yes, it might be in the business interest from a cost perspective, but actually looking at the value of a potential claim for that employee to bring, I think is really important in terms of, hypothetically, what are they going to be claiming? Like, what could they be claiming in a tribunal based on what has actually happened? Particularly if there's a situation where, that employee hasn't gone through any internal processes, they haven't submitted a grievance, they haven't done that. Like, we'll all be familiar with the ACAS uplift and things like that. So I think that's where I think hopefully what you've sort of taken on board is it's remembering the basics. It's not changing, the way that we're operating in terms of, it's not changing the law, it's not changing our processes, it's not changing our procedures. It's just that we're having to address things and deal with things slightly differently. So I'm not sure if that sort of helps that.
Another question we had was, if you have a gut feeling that a grievance has been submitted using AI, would you recommend raising this with a staff member, or is that muddying the water too unnecessarily? You don't need to investigate or establish how the document was drafted. I think you do risk muddying the waters somewhat. Really, you still want to deal with it in the normal way that you would in focusing on what the actual issues are. And if that's not clear, or we think that perhaps ChatGPT has elaborated on it, then it's perfectly reasonable just to ask them to confirm what is it that you're actually raising here. And sometimes a good way to do that is just to put it back to them, summarize your understanding of it, but to say, thanks very much. just to confirm, this is what we understand your grievance relates to. Please, can you confirm? And if there's nothing new raised after that, then to proceed with dealing with the grievance on that basis. I think I'd be reluctant to call somebody out for using AI, because fundamentally we can't stop using AI. We don't want it to don't want people to feel like well, we are preventing them from justice here. We are preventing them from raising their concerns in whatever way they want to. So I certainly wouldn't be telling anyone there's a blanket rule, no, you've got to write this yourself. But just use the tips that Alice mentioned in terms of focusing on what the actual facts are, and seeing if you can get somebody in a room or on a phone call to have a more human conversation to say, what is it actually your concerns are here, and how would you like us to deal with it? What are you proposing?
Yeah,
Hopefully that
yeah,
helps.
I agree. I think it's all about trying to break down that barrier that is now sort of being built up between the human connection of all of this. I was just looking at in terms of that, I was looking at Emma's question in terms of SARS and FOIs, so data subject access requests and freedom of information requests. So I think obviously it's one of the things, it's an increase that we've noticed, that and that is particularly because AI is at a very early stage saying submit a subject access request and do that now, and then complain to the ICO if it all goes wrong or if you don't get XYZ. Now, I think in terms of that, again, we go back to basics, we take it back, we say to that individual, like, what data do you want to obtain here? It's, you have to, you know, the parameters of what you're searching for, the scope of the request hasn't, that reasonableness hasn't changed in you know, recently. So it's going back and saying, look, can you clarify exactly like what you are wanting with this request? And I think that really helps those situations. I think it's always just adding that human element, that's just the normal question, and just seeing. But I appreciate we are still then, as soon as someone does submit a, you know, a valid subject access request, you are obviously required to deal with it. I'll just have a scroll through some of the other questions. Yes, there will be a recording sent out, and after this we'll send it out hopefully as soon as possible after this. You can take stuff away. I think, Tom, that's all of the questions. I'm just scrolling up.
Yeah, I just saw one about disciplinary policies, updating disciplinary policies to address AI. I think you're in a difficult territory if you're trying to say, do not use AI for internal processes. Do not use AI to help you with a disciplinary or to help you with a grievance. A slightly different issue, and not one that we really touched on in this webinar, but if you wanted to restrict the way that AI may be used for someone to perform their role, that's a different story. And certainly limitations can be placed on that if you don't want somebody to use ChatGPT for certain aspects of their job. Practical advice I'd give there is a blanket ban is going to be really difficult to enforce. You're really going to struggle, because the reality is people probably will do it anyway, and we've all got smartphones and we likely will. And equally, it is useful. We've been very negative, probably too negative about AI here, but the reality is everyone is dabbling, everyone in some way is using platforms or software that has an element of AI at the bare minimum. So it absolutely can be useful. But yeah, I hope that just about answers your question.
I think there's another question in terms of policies. In terms of AI policies, that's something that people are asking for more. I think it's a really sensible thing to have in place. So if you don't have an AI policy, do contact either one of us after this. In terms of what we'd be putting into an AI policy, it would be things like how we as an organisation expect these AI programs to be used, the sort of sensible use of them, confidentiality obligations, things like that all get built into a policy. But I think if you don't have one, definitely now is the right time to contact someone about getting one in place.
Thanks, Alice. I'm aware of the time. I'm sure that people need to head off. So if there's a question you had that we haven't been able to answer, please, by all means, reach out to us, drop us an ad on LinkedIn or drop us an email. We'd be very happy to answer any quick follow-up questions. Otherwise, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Our last slide is just our next webinar. Please sign up. Happy to have you on our next webinar as well on sick pay. And some of the changes that are on the way. But just a final comment. Thank you very much for coming along, and do stay in touch.
Thank you.